The sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows over the parched earth as it inched toward the horizon. A warm breeze swept across the barren landscape, stirring up dust that danced lazily in the fading light. The once vibrant Morgan Ranch now stood as a mere shell of its former self, the sprawling fields now overgrown with weeds, and the barn doors hanging on rusted hinges. The land, which had been the heartbeat of the Morgan family for generations, seemed to breathe its last breaths, much like the man who called it home. Jake Morgan sat on the weathered porch of his old ranch house, his boots propped up on the railing, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey by his side. The house, built by his grandfather's hands, creaked under the weight of years and neglect. Paint peeled from the wooden beams, and the windows, once sparkling with the laughter of family, were now clouded and cracked. Jake's eyes, sharp as ever despite the passing years, scanned the horizon, searching for nothing in particular, but lost in thought. He was a man forged by the unforgiving sun and the endless horizon. A retired rodeo cowboy, Jake had lived his life in the saddle, chasing the adrenaline of the arena and the freedom of the open range. But those days were long behind him. Now, the only remnants of his glory days were the faded photographs on the mantel and the collection of trophies gathering dust in the living room. His fingers traced the rim of the whiskey bottle as he absent-mindedly thought of the past. He could almost hear the echo of his wife's laughter, see the way her hair caught the light as she moved about the house, tending to the daily chores with a smile that never seemed to fade. Clara had been the anchor in his life, grounding him in a way that the rodeo never could. But cancer had taken her 10 years ago, leaving Jake alone with his memories and a ranch that seemed to die along with her. The wind picked up, rustling the papers that lay scattered on the porch table. Among them was a crisp, white envelope that stood out starkly against the faded wood. Jake's eyes fell on it, and the weight in his chest grew heavier. He reached for it, his hands rough and calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life working the land. Inside the envelope was an eviction notice, one final blow from the county, demanding payment for years of unpaid taxes. Jake had known this day would come. The bills had been piling up for years, and the ranch, once a thriving operation, had become more of a burden than a blessing. But seeing it in writing made it real, and the reality was a bitter pill to swallow. The only option left was to sell the ranch, but the thought of it made Jake's heart ache. This land was more than just dirt and grass. It was a piece of him, of Clara, of the life they had built together. He crumpled the notice in his fist, his jaw tightening as he fought back the wave of emotions threatening to overtake him. He wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The ranch was all he had left, and the memories that clung to every corner of it were too precious to lose. But as he looked out over the land, he couldn't ignore the truth. The ranch was dying, and no amount of stubbornness could bring it back to life. Jake took a long swig from the bottle, the whiskey burning its way down his throat, a temporary balm for the pain that simmered just beneath the surface. He stared out at the setting sun, the sky ablaze with colors that reminded him of Clara's favorite time of day. The day was coming to an end, just like the life he had known. But as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Jake felt a spark of resolve ignite within him. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. There was still a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. He'd ride into town, talk to the bank, see if there was any way to save the ranch. If he had to sell off the cattle, so be it. But he wouldn't give up without a fight. Clara wouldn't have wanted that, and Jake wasn't the kind of man to walk away from a fight. As darkness settled over the ranch, Jake stood up from the porch, his mind made up. Tomorrow he'd start making calls, see what could be done. He might be an old cowboy, but he still had some fight left in him. And as long as there was a sliver of hope, he'd hold on to this land with everything he had. Jake Morgan wasn't ready to say goodbye to the only life he'd ever known. Not yet. The morning sun filtered through the cracked blinds of the old ranch house, casting slivers of light onto the worn wooden floor. Jake Morgan stood at the kitchen counter, a pot of coffee brewing beside him, its rich aroma filling the small room. His thoughts were still consumed by the eviction notice, but today he was determined to take action. He would head into town, speak to the bank, and do whatever it took to keep the ranch in his hands. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, the sound of gravel crunching outside caught his attention. Jake glanced out the window, expecting to see the usual delivery truck or maybe a neighbor dropping by. Instead, his gaze fell on a sleek, black sedan that looked out of place among the rusted trucks and dusty landscapes of the Texas countryside. The car door opened, and a young man stepped out, his silhouette sharply contrasting with the rugged surroundings. Dressed in jeans that were too clean and a shirt that screamed city life, the young man hesitated for a moment, taking in the sight of the ranch before making his way toward the house. Jake's brow furrowed in confusion, trying to place the unfamiliar figure. But it wasn't until the young man got closer that recognition dawned. Ethan, Jake muttered under his breath, the name tasting strange on his tongue after so many years. He hadn't seen his grandson since Ethan was a child, just a boy running around the ranch with wild curiosity. But the young man walking toward him was a stranger, tall and lanky, with the same sharp eyes that Jake saw in the mirror every morning, but softened by youth and a life lived far from the hardships of the land. Jake stepped out onto the porch, his weathered hand resting on the railing as he watched Ethan approach. The young man paused at the foot of the steps, looking up at his grandfather with a mix of emotions Jake couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity perhaps, but also something more guarded, like apprehension. "Grandpa," Ethan finally said, his voice steady but lacking the warmth Jake remembered from years ago. "Ethan," Jake replied, tipping his hat in greeting, but making no move to come closer. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was years of silence, of missed birthdays and holidays spent apart. They stood there for a moment, neither knowing what to say. The last time they had seen each other, Ethan had been just a boy, wide-eyed and eager to help with chores around the ranch. But life had taken them down different paths. Ethan's mother, Jake's daughter, had moved to New York after the death of her mother, taking Ethan with her and leaving Jake to his solitary life on the ranch. The occasional phone call and Christmas card had been their only contact since. I was in town for a conference," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Thought I'd come by and see how you were doing." Jake studied his grandson for a moment, searching for any hint of the boy he once knew. But all he saw was a city kid, out of place and unsure of himself in this rugged landscape. "Didn't expect to see you out here," Jake said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," Ethan replied, shifting awkwardly. "Too long, I guess." There was an awkward pause, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Ethan glanced around, his eyes taking in the ranch that had been the backdrop of his childhood summers. But now it seemed smaller, more worn, and less like the place of adventure he remembered. You look good," Ethan offered, though he could see the toll the years had taken on Jake. His grandfather's face was more lined, his frame thinner, but there was still that same steel in his eyes, the kind that came from a life of hard work and stubborn resilience. Jake nodded, appreciating the attempt, but he wasn't one for small talk. "You hungry?" he asked, turning toward the door. "Got some coffee on." Ethan hesitated, then nodded, following his grandfather into the house. The kitchen was just as he remembered, small, with outdated appliances and cabinets that had seen better days. But there was a comfort in its familiarity, even if the years had worn it down. Jake poured Ethan a cup of coffee, sliding it across the table before taking a seat himself. They sat in silence for a moment, each sipping their coffee, unsure of how to bridge the years of distance between them. "So," Jake finally said, setting his cup down with a clink, "what brings you out here, really?" Ethan looked down at his cup, the steam swirling up as if offering a momentary distraction. "I guess I just wanted to see you," he admitted. "It's been a long time, and I thought maybe we could catch up." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, not out of suspicion, but out of the discomfort that came with the realization that his grandson was a stranger to him now. "Catch up, huh?" he echoed. "Don't know if there's much to catch up on. Life here's the same as it's always been." Ethan looked around, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the sagging roof, and the general air of neglect that permeated the place. "Doesn't look the same," he said quietly, more to himself than to Jake. Jake followed his grandson's gaze, seeing the ranch through Ethan's eyes. Old, tired, a far cry from the bustling homestead it once was. "Time's been hard on it," he admitted, his voice gruff. "Hard on me, too." There was another pause, the kind that felt heavy with all the things they weren't saying. Finally, Ethan spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Mom said, she said things have been tough out here, that you might lose the ranch." Jake's jaw tightened at the mention of his daughter. He wasn't surprised she'd been talking. She'd always been one to worry. "Yeah," he said simply, not offering more than that. Ethan nodded, not pushing the subject. Instead, he changed the topic, asking about the ranch, the cattle, anything to keep the conversation going. But each answer Jake gave was clipped, revealing little beyond the surface. The truth was, the years had worn Jake down, and the thought of losing the ranch was a pain he wasn't ready to share, even with his own flesh and blood. After what felt like an eternity, the conversation petered out, and they were left sitting in silence once more. Ethan fidgeted with his coffee cup, unsure of what to do or say next. He had come all this way, but now that he was here, he realized he didn't know how to connect with the man sitting across from him. Jake could sense his grandson's unease and, despite himself, felt a pang of regret. This boy was family, the last link he had to his daughter, to Clara. But the years had driven a wedge between them, and Jake wasn't sure how to bridge it. "Maybe," Jake started, his voice rough as he struggled to find the right words. "Maybe you could stick around for a bit. Got some things need doing around here, and it'd be good to have an extra set of hands." Ethan looked up, surprised by the offer. It wasn't exactly the warm invitation he had hoped for, but it was something. "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'd like that." Jake nodded, relief flooding through him, though he kept his expression stern. "Good," he said. "We'll start tomorrow. Got a lot of work ahead of us." Ethan nodded, finishing his coffee and feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, uncertainty, and a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to reconnect with the man he used to look up to as a hero. As they stood to clear the table, Jake caught a glimpse of something familiar in Ethan's eyes, something he hadn't seen in years. It was the same spark of curiosity, the same drive that had once made the boy eager to follow his grandfather around the ranch. Maybe they had more in common than Jake had thought. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't ready to let go of the ranch, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't ready to let go of family, either. The early morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the ranch house, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Jake Morgan was already up, his boots laced tight and his old cowboy hat perched on his head. He moved with a purpose that had been missing for years, his mind set on the journey ahead. Today, he and Ethan would begin the long drive to Mexico, a last-ditch effort to save the ranch by selling off the remaining cattle. Ethan, still groggy from sleep, shuffled into the kitchen, his hair tousled and eyes heavy with the remnants of the night. He wasn't used to the early hours his grandfather kept, and the prospect of a road trip across state lines was both daunting and exciting. The tension between them had eased slightly over the past few days, though their conversations were still stilted and brief. The road ahead offered a chance to change that, though neither of them would admit it. Jake glanced at his grandson as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "You ready?" he asked, his voice gruff, but lacking the sharpness it once held. Ethan nodded, stifling a yawn. "Yeah, I'm ready," he replied, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter. He had packed light, just a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes and his laptop. Not that he expected much use for it out on the road. The plan was simple. Drive down to Mexico, find a buyer for the cattle, and return with enough money to pay off the debts and keep the ranch afloat for a little longer. It wasn't much, but it was all Jake could think to do. The cattle were his last asset, and he wasn't about to let them go for nothing. They loaded up the old pickup truck, the bed weighed down with supplies and gear. The cattle, already corralled and ready, would be driven to a nearby rail station, where they'd be loaded onto a train bound for Mexico. Jake had made arrangements with an old contact south of the border, a man he hoped would still be willing to make a fair deal. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. As they pulled out of the ranch, the sun just beginning to rise over the Texas plains, the landscape stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving. The miles of open road were both a physical and metaphorical journey for the two men, one that neither of them fully understood yet. For the first few hours, the drive was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional clink of tools shifting in the back. Jake kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, while Ethan stared out the window, watching as the familiar Texas terrain slowly gave way to the unfamiliar. It wasn't until they stopped at a small roadside diner for lunch that the silence was broken. The diner was a relic of the past, with cracked vinyl seats and a neon sign that buzzed faintly in the background. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fried food and strong coffee, and the few patrons who occupied the booths were more interested in their meals than in the newcomers. They found a booth near the window, and after placing their orders, the silence between them grew heavy again. Jake sipped his coffee, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Ethan fidgeted with the napkin dispenser, unsure of how to bridge the gap. Finally, it was Ethan who spoke first. "So, what's Mexico like?" he asked, his voice tentative. Jake looked up, surprised by the question. "Hot," he replied with a slight grin. "Dry, too. Not all that different from here in some parts, but it's a whole different world once you get into the towns. Folks are friendly enough, though, if you know how to talk to them." Ethan nodded, intrigued despite himself. "And this guy we're meeting? He's gonna buy the cattle?" "His name's Jorge, and he's been in the business a long time. Used to run a big ranch down there. But I haven't seen him in years. I'm hoping he still remembers the old times," Jake said, his tone carrying a hint of uncertainty. The conversation drifted off again, but the ice had been broken, and that was something. They finished their meal in relative silence and got back on the road, the sun climbing higher in the sky as they pushed further south. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat plains of Texas gave way to rolling hills, and the air grew warmer, the sun beating down with an intensity that made the truck's old air conditioner work overtime. They stopped again at a small town to refuel, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were met with cautious eyes. It was there that they met Linda. She was sitting on a bench outside the gas station, strumming an old guitar and singing softly to herself, her voice carrying a melancholy tune that seemed to match the dusty surroundings. Linda was in her mid-30s, with long dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders and eyes that held a depth of stories untold. She wore a flowing dress that seemed out of place in the dry heat, and as Jake and Ethan approached, she looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Afternoon." Jake greeted her with a nod, his gaze lingering on the guitar for a moment. "Afternoon," Linda replied, her voice warm and inviting, despite the weariness that clung to her like a shadow. "You folks passing through?" "Headed down to Mexico," Jake said simply. "You?" Linda shrugged, her fingers still idly plucking at the strings. "Just wandering. Been on the road for a while now, looking for something, though I'm not sure what." Ethan, intrigued by the mysterious woman, spoke up. "Are you a singer?" Linda chuckled softly, her eyes glinting with amusement. "I suppose you could say that. I sing when the mood strikes, but I wouldn't call myself a professional. Just a woman with a guitar and too much time on her hands." There was something about Linda that drew Ethan in, a kind of quiet strength mixed with a hint of sadness that he couldn't quite place. She seemed like someone who had seen more than her fair share of life's ups and downs, yet still managed to keep moving forward. "You headed south?" Jake asked, his tone more curious than cautious. "Maybe," Linda replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Depends on where the road takes me. Mexico sounds nice, though." Jake glanced at Ethan, who nodded slightly, then turned back to Linda. "We've got some room in the truck if you want a ride." Linda considered the offer for a moment before nodding. "Why not? Beats sitting here in the sun." With that, Linda joined them in the truck, her guitar carefully stowed in the back seat beside her. As they continued their journey, the atmosphere in the truck shifted slightly, the presence of a third person easing the tension between Jake and Ethan. Linda proved to be an easy companion, sharing stories of her travels and singing softly as they drove. Her voice was hauntingly beautiful, the kind that made you stop and listen, and Ethan found himself drawn to the sound, the way it seemed to fill the empty spaces in the truck. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, they pulled into a small town near the border to rest for the night. The motel was a simple, run-down place, but it had clean beds and hot showers, and that was all they needed. After checking in, they decided to grab dinner at a nearby diner. The place was lively, filled with locals and travelers alike, the air thick with the smell of sizzling meat and spices. It was there that they encountered Hector. Hector was a large man, his broad shoulders and muscular frame hinting at a life of hard labor. His face was weathered, his skin tanned from years spent under the sun, but his eyes were sharp, and there was a certain dignity in the way he carried himself. He was sitting alone at the counter, nursing a beer and watching the world go by. Jake recognized him immediately. "Hector?" he called out, surprise evident in his voice. Hector turned, his eyes widening in recognition. "Jake Morgan, as I live and breathe," he exclaimed, getting up to greet his old friend with a hearty handshake. "It's been a long time, old man." "Too long," Jake agreed, a rare smile breaking through his usual stern expression. What brings you here? Hector shrugged, a shadow passing over his face. Just passing through, like always. Life hasn't been as kind as I'd hoped, but I'm still kicking. They invited Hector to join them for dinner, and as they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Hector had once been a rodeo champion, a man at the top of his game, but the years had taken their toll. Injuries and bad luck had left him down on his luck, but his spirit remained unbroken. As they shared stories and laughter, the walls between Jake and Ethan began to crumble, the distance between them slowly closing. It wasn't just the shared experiences that brought them together, but the realization that they weren't so different after all. Each of them, Jake, Ethan, Linda, and Hector, carried their own burdens, their own scars, but together they found a sense of camaraderie that had been missing from their lives for too long. By the time they left the diner, the night was dark, the stars scattered across the sky like 1,000 tiny diamonds. They walked back to the motel in comfortable silence, the cool night air a welcome relief after the heat of the day. As they settled in for the night, Jake lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The road to Mexico was long, and the outcome uncertain. But with Ethan by his side and new friends along the way, Jake couldn't help but feel that they were on the right path. And so, as the night wore on and the sounds of the town faded into the distance, Jake allowed himself to drift off to sleep, the weight on his shoulders just a little lighter, and the road ahead just a little brighter. The morning sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the dusty landscape as the group prepared to cross the border into Mexico. Jake, Ethan, Linda, and Hector had spent the previous night in a small town near the border, gathering their strength and finalizing their plans for the journey ahead. There was a quiet determination in the air as they loaded up the truck, the knowledge that the most difficult part of their journey was still to come. The border crossing was a mixture of chaos and routine. Long lines of vehicles snaked their way toward the checkpoint, filled with travelers, merchants, and locals going about their daily business. The group fell into the line, the truck rumbling forward inch by inch as they approached the border guards. Jake kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. He had crossed this border many times before, but never with so much at stake. The cattle, loaded onto the train the day before, would be waiting for them on the other side. But they had to get there first, and the thought of something going wrong gnawed at him. Ethan, sitting in the passenger seat, could sense his grandfather's tension. He had never been to Mexico, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead made him uneasy. But there was also a sense of excitement, the thrill of adventure that had been missing from his life in the city. He glanced over at Jake, seeing the set jaw, the steely gaze, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of admiration for the old cowboy. This was a man who had faced down life's challenges time and time again, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing respect for him. Linda and Hector sat in the back, their presence a comforting reminder that they weren't alone in this. Linda hummed softly to herself, the notes of a song drifting through the cab, while Hector kept a watchful eye on the road, his instincts honed from years of living on the edge. As they finally reached the front of the line, a border guard stepped forward, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. He signaled for Jake to roll down the window, and the two men exchanged a few terse words in Spanish. After a moment, the guard nodded and waved them through, and with a sense of relief, they crossed into Mexico. The landscape changed almost immediately. The roads were rougher, the towns more vibrant but worn, and the air carried a different scent, a mix of spices, dust, and something uniquely Mexican. They drove through the bustling streets, navigating their way toward the rendezvous point, where they were to meet Jorge and finalize the sale of the cattle. But as they neared their destination, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. The streets grew narrower, the buildings more dilapidated, and the people they passed gave them curious, sometimes suspicious, looks. It wasn't long before they realized they were being followed. Jake caught sight of the car in the rearview mirror, a beat-up sedan that had been tailing them for several miles. He said nothing at first, not wanting to alarm the others, but when the car pulled up alongside them at a stoplight, he knew they were in trouble. "Stay calm," Jake muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the car beside them. The windows were tinted, hiding the occupants from view, but Jake had a bad feeling in his gut. As the light turned green, the sedan swerved in front of them, blocking their path. Two men stepped out, both of them wearing dark clothes and hard expressions. They looked like trouble, the kind that didn't care much for the law. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the men approach. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the fear was palpable. But as he glanced at Jake, he saw no fear, only a cold determination. His grandfather had faced down bulls and wild horses. These men were just another challenge. Jake stepped out of the truck, his hand resting on the handle of his old revolver, the one he had carried for years but hadn't had to use in a long time. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice steady and commanding. The taller of the two men, a lean figure with a scar running down the side of his face, sneered at Jake. "We heard you're moving some cattle. Thought we'd help lighten your load," he said in broken English, his tone mocking. Jake's grip tightened on the revolver. "Ain't nothing for you here," he replied, his voice low and dangerous. "Best you move along." The man with the scar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I don't think so, old man. Hand over the keys, and maybe we'll let you and your friends walk away." Jake didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake," he warned, his voice cold as ice. At that moment, Ethan stepped out of the truck, his heart racing but his resolve firm. "Grandpa," he said quietly, trying to catch Jake's eye. "Maybe we should just get back in the truck, Ethan." Jake cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. But the men weren't interested in negotiations. The second man, shorter and stockier, moved toward Ethan, a knife flashing in his hand. "Hand over the keys, kid, or you'll be sorry." Ethan's mind raced, panic threatening to overtake him. But then, something clicked. He wasn't just some city kid anymore, and he wasn't about to let his grandfather face this alone. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. Jake saw the knife, saw the danger, and in a split second, he made his move. Drawing his revolver, he aimed it at the man with the scar, his voice like steel. "Drop the knife and walk away. Now." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the gun in Jake's hand. There was a standoff, the air thick with tension, as both sides weighed their options. Ethan, his heart pounding, realized this was his chance to prove himself. While the men were distracted, he reached into the truck and grabbed a heavy wrench from the toolbox. With a surge of adrenaline, he swung it at the man with the knife, catching him off guard and knocking the weapon out of his hand. The man stumbled back, cursing in Spanish, but before he could recover, Hector and Linda were out of the truck, backing up Jake and Ethan. Hector, a man who had seen his fair share of fights, moved in with the confidence of someone who knew how to handle himself. Linda, though less physically imposing, stood her ground, her eyes fierce and determined. The man with the scar saw that the odds were no longer in his favor. He glared at Jake, his lip curling in anger. but he knew better than to push his luck. With a final sneer, he motioned to his companion, and the two men retreated to their car. "You'll regret this, old man," the scarred man spat as they sped away, tires screeching on the pavement. Jake watched them go, his revolver still in hand, until they disappeared around a corner. Only then did he lower the gun, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ethan stood there, the wrench still clutched in his hand, his mind reeling from what had just happened. His heart was still racing, but there was a sense of triumph mixed with the adrenaline. He had faced down a dangerous situation and come out the other side, and more importantly, he had earned his grandfather's respect. Jake turned to Ethan, his expression softening for the first time. "You did good, kid," he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Real good." Ethan managed a shaky smile, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Thanks, Grandpa," he replied, his voice filled with a mix of relief and pride. Linda and Hector exchanged glances, both of them impressed by how the situation had played out. "We should get moving," Linda suggested, her voice calm and steady. "The sooner we get to Jorge, the better." Jake nodded, holstering his revolver and heading back to the truck. As they climbed in, the mood was different, lighter, more confident. They had faced a challenge together, and it had brought them closer, the bond between Jake and Ethan growing stronger with each passing mile. The rest of the journey to Jorge's ranch was uneventful, the tension from the encounter slowly fading as they neared their destination. When they finally arrived, Jorge was waiting for them, a broad smile on his face as he welcomed them with open arms. The deal went smoothly, Jorge offering a fair price for the cattle, more than enough to cover the debts and keep the ranch afloat. As they sat down to a celebratory meal, the relief was palpable, the weight of their troubles lifting as they realized they had succeeded. But it wasn't just the money that mattered. It was the journey, the challenges they had faced together, and the way it had brought them closer. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. He had his grandson by his side, a young man who had proven himself in ways Jake hadn't expected. As they raised their glasses in a toast, Jake looked around at the faces of his newfound friends. Linda, with her mysterious past and kind heart, Hector with his strength and loyalty, and Ethan, his grandson, who had shown more courage than Jake could have hoped for. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jake knew they could face whatever came their way. Together, they were stronger, and that was something worth fighting for. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as Jake and Ethan Morgan pulled into the driveway of the Morgan Ranch. The old pickup truck rumbled to a stop, the engine settling into a soft purr before Jake cut the ignition. The familiar sight of the ranch greeted them, a patchwork of fields, the weathered barn, and the house that had stood the test of time, much like the man who called it home. But something had changed. The ranch, once a place weighed down by memories of loss and hardship, now seemed to shimmer with a quiet hope. The journey to Mexico had done more than save the ranch from financial ruin. It had breathed new life into it, and more importantly, it had brought Jake and Ethan closer, in ways neither of them could have anticipated. As they stepped out of the truck, the cool evening air wrapped around them, carrying the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers. Jake looked around, his gaze lingering on the fields that had been in the family for generations. There was work to be done, repairs to be made. But for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Instead, he felt a sense of possibility, of a future that was no longer overshadowed by the past. Ethan, too, felt the change. The city boy who had arrived at the ranch just days earlier, unsure of himself and his place in the world, now stood with a newfound confidence. The road trip had shown him a side of life he had never known, a life of hard work, resilience, and deep connections to the land and family. And as he looked at his grandfather, he saw not just an old cowboy, but a man who had lived a full life, who had faced down challenges with grit and determination, and who had so much more to teach him. They walked side by side toward the house, the silence between them comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than awkwardness. As they reached the porch, Jake paused, turning to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Jake began, his voice softer than usual, "this place isn't what it used to be. It's seen better days, and it's going to take a lot of work to get it back on its feet." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the ranch. "Yeah, I know, but it's worth it, right? This ranch, it's part of who we are." Jake looked at his grandson, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You sound like your grandma," he said, his voice filled with a mix of fondness and melancholy. "She always believed in this place, even when I couldn't see it." Ethan returned the smile, feeling a warmth in his chest at the mention of his grandmother. He had never known her, not really, but through his grandfather's stories and the lingering presence in every corner of the ranch, he felt connected to her in a way that was both comforting and inspiring. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his voice steady, "about what I want to do next. I was planning on going back to New York, finishing school, but maybe that can wait. I want to stay here, help you rebuild the ranch. We can make it something great again, together." Jake was silent for a moment, his eyes searching Ethan's face. He had always been a man of few words, preferring action to sentiment, but in that moment, he felt a rush of emotion he couldn't ignore. The idea of having his grandson by his side, working the land together, was something he hadn't dared to hope for. It was the kind of second chance that life rarely offered, and Jake wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. "You sure about that?" Jake asked, his voice gruff, but his eyes soft. "It's not going to be easy, and there's a lot you'd be giving up." Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm sure. I've been thinking a lot about what really matters, and I don't want to miss out on this. I want to learn from you, Grandpa. I want to make this ranch something we can both be proud of." Jake's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. He reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm, but full of warmth. "You're a good man, Ethan. Your grandma would be proud of you. And so am I." The words hung in the air between them, filled with all the emotions that had been left unspoken for too long. It was a moment of connection, of reconciliation, and of a new beginning for both of them. As they stood there, the last rays of sunlight bathing the ranch in a golden glow, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The ghosts of the past, the memories that had haunted him, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the promise of the future. "Come on," Jake said, breaking the silence with a nod toward the barn. "We've got work to do. This place isn't going to fix itself." Ethan grinned, the excitement of the challenge ahead sparking in his eyes. "Lead the way, Grandpa." They walked together toward the barn, their steps in sync, their hearts aligned. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with long days and hard labor, but they were ready to face it together. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Jake and Ethan stood side by side, looking out over the land that was now theirs to rebuild. The ranch, once a place of sorrow and loss, had become a symbol of hope and renewal. And as they turned back toward the house, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, Jake felt a deep sense of contentment. The past was behind him, the future was bright, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to embrace it. They didn't need words to express what they were feeling. The bond between them had been forged through fire, tested by challenges, and strengthened by love. And as they rode off into the sunset, the future stretched out before them like an open road, full of possibilities. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next, and that was all that mattered.